Nearly a decade has passed, yet in Indonesia, this is still remembered as the most haunting crime scene the country's police have ever walked into. The setting of today's case is Tangerang Regency in Banten Province, a region pressed against the western edge of Jakarta and home to one of Indonesia's largest industrial belts. Thousands of factories producing textiles, electronics, plastics, and packaging are scattered across the area. Within many of these factory compounds, companies also build low-rise housing blocks for their workers. Indonesians call them MEs, essentially factory dormitories. Most of the workers here come from distant provinces. They have no homes in the city, and renting a room outside the factory can be expensive. So having a place to sleep just steps away from work is something almost everyone hopes for. The dormitories are divided into separate sections for men and women, with a courtyard and an iron gate between them. Men are not allowed to enter the women's quarters, and that gate is supposed to serve as the boundary. It looks secure enough, but in reality it is just an ordinary gate, one that anyone can push open if it has not been properly closed. In May 2016, inside one of the rooms in the women's section of such a dormitory, an 18-year-old girl was found dead. Her name was Eno Farihah, and for nearly a year afterward, that name dominated headlines across Indonesia. What has kept this case alive in people's memories to this day is not only the brutality of the crime, but the way it unfolded. Before we begin, I want to give you a warning. This is an extremely disturbing case, so I will only describe what is necessary for you to understand what happened. I will not go into graphic detail about what was done to the victim. Please keep that in mind before deciding whether to continue. So, who was Eno Farihah? And how did a young woman who seemingly had no serious conflict with anyone end up facing a night like that? To understand, we need to turn back the clock and return to the time when she was still a child growing up in the countryside. Eno was born on October 6, 1997, in Kampung Bangkir, a small village in Pegandikan, Lebakwangi, Serang. Serang is also part of Banten Province, just like Tangerang, but while Tangerang lies within Jakarta's sprawling industrial belt, Serang sits farther to the west, where much of the land is still covered by rice fields. Eno came from one of the most ordinary families in the area. Her father was Arif Fikri, her mother was Mapudo, and together they had 7 children. Eno was the third. Try to imagine raising 7 children in rural Indonesia. That means 7 sets of school expenses, 7 children to feed, and 7 sets of clothes, often handed down and altered once an older sibling had outgrown them. The third child in a family like that often grows up somewhere in the middle, without the special attention given to the eldest and without being doted on like the youngest children. And growing up in that middle space tends to teach a person how to take care of themselves earlier than most. Eno finished high school in 2015. Instead of continuing her education or staying home and waiting for a marriage arranged by the adults in her family, as many young women in her village did, she chose a path familiar to young people from poorer parts of Indonesia. It is called merantau, a word that means leaving your hometown to seek work elsewhere, but also carries the deeper meaning of leaving home in order to grow up and make your own way in the world. Eno told her family that she wanted to earn her own money and help ease some of the burden on her parents. She found work at PT Polita Global Mandiri, a plastics factory in the Kosambi area of Tangerang. Her position was listed as an operator, meaning she worked directly on the production machinery, with each operator assisted by a helper during the shift. The distance between her hometown and the factory was too great to commute every day, so Eno moved into the company dormitory and began living independently at just 18 years old. There is one detail worth pausing on. Eno had actually worked at Polita before and later resigned, possibly because operating machinery inside a plastics factory was simply too physically demanding for a young woman of her small build. But once she left, she discovered that other jobs paid less and offered working conditions that were no better. So in November 2015, she applied to return to the same factory. Because she had maintained a clean employment record, the company immediately took her back. It was a completely reasonable decision. But it was also the decision that brought her back to that very dormitory. This time, however, things were different. Most of the people who had lived there during Eno's first stay were already gone, and the dormitory was now filled with unfamiliar faces. When dozens of strangers live under the same roof, friction is almost inevitable, and Eno experienced some of it herself. On one occasion, she was sitting with several friends, laughing and talking, when another woman from the dormitory walked past and assumed they were gossiping about her. What should have been a minor misunderstanding escalated to the point where the woman pulled Eno away and threatened her. Aside from that incident, however, most of the people who worked with Eno remembered her in much the same way. They described her as gentle and approachable, someone who would always respond when spoken to. At work, she was considered one of the most skilled operators on her shift, and Eno was attractive. In a factory where men greatly outnumbered women, that was not an insignificant detail. In the eyes of many people around her, Eno was considered one of the most beautiful young women in the entire complex. Quite a few men at the factory tried to get close to her, from half-joking flirtation to outright confessions of love, and Eno turned them all down gently. Some of the men pursuing her were considerably older, with steadier jobs and enough maturity to think seriously about a long-term relationship. And yet, in the end, the person who managed to stir something in Eno's heart was none of them. It happened sometime around April 2016. One afternoon after finishing her shift, Eno was walking from the factory back to the dormitory. Along the way, she had to pass through a narrow alley near a mosque in Jatimulya village. At the entrance to the alley, a group of young men were sitting around talking, the kind of casual late-afternoon gathering you can find almost anywhere. One of them saw Eno walking past, stood up, called out to her, and asked if he could get to know her. His name was Rahmat Alim, the son of a man named Nayuddin. His family lived nearby, not far from Eno's dormitory. And Alim was only 15 years old, still a junior high school student. For a junior high school boy to stop a female factory worker 3 years older than him and ask for her phone number was certainly bold. But perhaps it was that very confidence, combined with the boyishness still visible on his face, that amused Eno. Instead of walking away, she stopped and talked to him. And when he asked for her number, she gave it to him. There was just one thing. When Alim asked her name, Eno did not tell him the truth. She told him her name was Inda. I don't know what was going through her mind at that moment, and perhaps no one ever will. Maybe she wanted to keep some distance from a stranger she had just met on the street. Maybe she was simply being playful, the way people sometimes use a different name when talking to strangers online. Whatever the reason, Alim never suspected a thing. As far as he knew, the girl he had just met was named Inda. Starting that very night, the two began texting each other. At first, the messages were simple and polite, just basic greetings and small talk. But little by little, those conversations stretched later into the night. After some time, Alim told her how he felt, and Eno agreed to become his girlfriend. But this is perhaps the strangest part of their entire relationship. For the full month that followed their meeting in that alley, the two of them never saw each other again. Their romance existed entirely through a phone screen, between a girl using a false name and a 15-year-old boy who had never known the real name of the person he believed he was in love with. Then Eno began to miss him, and she decided she wanted to see him again. For a moment, we have to leave Eno's story and turn our attention to two other men who were living and working inside that same factory complex. Two men who had never truly entered her life in any way that mattered to her. The first was Rahmat Arifin, 24 years old. The second was Imam Hapriyati, also 24. Both worked for Polita, and both lived in the men's section of the same factory dormitory. And there was something unusual about these two men. Arifin and Hapriyati did not know each other. They worked in the same factory, lived in the same dormitory complex, and were both interested in the same young woman. Yet, until that night, they had never exchanged a single word. We begin with Arifin. He liked Eno and had approached her many times in the rough, casual way young men on a factory floor sometimes do, teasing her and throwing out flirtatious remarks whenever he happened to pass by. Eno didn't like that kind of attention, so she handled it the way many young women do when someone won't stop bothering them. She joked back and tried to brush it off. Arifin had very dark skin, and whenever he teased her, Eno would respond by calling him bitter black coffee. To her, it was nothing more than a teasing nickname, something meant to get him to stop following her around. She didn't say it just once. She said it several times, always with a laugh. In her mind, perhaps, it was something as light and insignificant as a speck of dust. But to Arifin, it did not feel insignificant at all. He was attracted to her, and he had been hoping for a sincere response. Instead, what he heard was a nickname aimed directly at his appearance, sometimes spoken in front of their co-workers. At 24, with pride easily wounded and ego running high, a joke like that did not simply stop at the surface. It sank deeper. And each time it was repeated, whatever affection he had felt began to give way to something else, a quiet bitterness that kept building beneath the surface. The second man, Hapriyadi, took a different path, but eventually arrived at much the same place. He worked in a section close to Eno's, and for a time, even shared the same shift. It was during those hours spent working near each other that he began noticing her. One day, he finally gathered the courage to tell her how he felt. Eno rejected him in the gentle way that had become typical of her. She did not tell him directly, "I don't like you." Instead, she said that she was not interested in being in a relationship at the moment because she wanted to focus on working and helping support her parents. It was a kind way to reject someone. And in this case, perhaps it was precisely that kindness that made the situation dangerous. Hapriyadi heard what he wanted to hear. He convinced himself that Eno was not saying she disliked him, only that she was not ready for a relationship yet. In his mind, that meant he still had a chance. So he began messaging her. Not once or twice, but day after day. Dozens of messages became hundreds, flooding Eno's phone with expressions of concern, questions about her day, and relentless attempts to win her over. Eno did not respond to a single one of those messages. She did not block his number, and she never lashed out at him. At the factory, she continued treating him normally, as though nothing had happened. From the outside, Eno's way of handling the situation was almost textbook. She kept the peace at work while giving him no reason to believe he still had a chance. But Hapriyadi did not see it that way. To him, sending hundreds of messages and receiving not even a single word in return did not feel like a polite rejection. It felt like contempt. Slowly, he began telling himself that this girl was arrogant, that she looked down on him, that in her eyes, he was nothing. Then, at some point, both men learned that Eno already had a boyfriend. The girl who said she was not ready for a relationship, the girl who refused to answer the messages, was apparently involved with someone else, after all. The night of May 12th, 2016, was an ordinary Thursday night. The work shifts were over, the factory compound had fallen quiet, and most of the workers in the dormitories were already asleep because everyone had to wake early for the next morning's shift. At around 11:30 p.m., Eno sent Aleem a message. It was simple. She told him she missed him and wanted to see him. She asked him to come to her dormitory and said she would leave the gate slightly open so he could get inside. Aleem replied with only a few words. Okay, he would come right away. His house was not far away, and at that hour, the roads were nearly empty. Just as she had promised, Eno went out and left the iron gate between the two dormitory sections slightly open. Aleem slipped across the dark courtyard and walked straight into her room without anyone else in the complex noticing. Inside that small room, for the first time in a month, the two of them were finally sitting face to face in real life. They talked for a long time about all kinds of things. At first, the atmosphere was warm, then gradually became more intimate. Eventually, Aleem wanted to take things further. Eno refused for a very real reason. She was afraid of becoming pregnant. She was only 18, and in her circumstances, an unplanned pregnancy could have destroyed everything she had been trying to build for herself. Aleem pleaded with her several more times, but Eno did not change her mind. Her decision was completely understandable, but he was still too young to understand that being told no was not the same as being humiliated. He felt rejected. His pride was wounded. Angry, he stood up, left the room, crossed the courtyard, and started heading home. Eno let him go. Perhaps she assumed that once he cooled down, he would message her again, the kind of brief argument young couples have all the time. Then she went to bed and fell asleep. The problem was that, on that very same night, across the courtyard, both Arifin and Hapriyadi had independently decided to go looking for Eno. They had not arranged to meet. Neither knew the other was coming. And yet they ran into each other right in the courtyard outside the women's section, two figures crouched in the darkness, each moving quietly as if sneaking around. According to the statements both men later gave, the encounter was awkward at first. Hapriyadi saw an unfamiliar man blocking his way and panicked, thinking he might be a dormitory security guard. He immediately blurted out that he had come to see Eno. Arifin froze when he heard that, because he had come for exactly the same reason. It took only a few sentences for the two strangers to realize that they believed they were carrying the same wound. And there, in the darkness of that courtyard, they became allies. Then a third figure emerged from the women's section. It was Alim, the 15-year-old schoolboy who had just been rejected by his girlfriend, now heading home with anger written across his face. Arifin stopped him and demanded to know who he was and what he was doing inside the women's dormitory at that hour. Alim, still upset, answered sharply that he had just come from his girlfriend's room and that her name was Inda. The two older men stared at him in confusion. There was no woman named Inda living in that section. Alim insisted there was, then pointed toward the room he had just left. All three turned to look in the direction of his finger. It was Eno Farihah's room. And this is where the false name Eno had invented a month earlier. A small barrier she had created to keep some distance from a stranger she met on the street, suddenly turned against her. Had the boy simply said her real name, perhaps the moment would have ended there. The two older men would have learned only that Eno already had a boyfriend, and at worst they might have walked away furious. But because the name did not match, all three men came to believe at the same time that they had uncovered something, that this girl had somehow deceived all of them. The anger of the first two men was already there. Now it was joined by the anger of a third. And within only a few minutes of talking in that courtyard, three people who had barely known one another had formed themselves into a group. They walked toward the room. The iron gate between the two dormitory sections was still slightly open because Alim had not closed it when he left. Eno's room was also unlocked. She believed Alim had shut the gate behind him. Inside, Eno was asleep. Around midnight, the three entered quietly and stood beside her bed until Eno suddenly woke. She immediately fought back and tried to call for help, but everything happened too quickly. According to statements later recorded in the case, Hapriyadi used a pillow to cover her mouth while the other two restrained her. She was unable to escape, and she was then sexually assaulted. At some point during the attack, Alim left the room intending to find a knife. He searched the kitchen area but could not find one. Instead, he found a gardening hoe and brought it back. From the moment that hoe entered the room, the accounts from different sources begin to conflict. Some say Alim was told to use it to attack Eno. Others say Arifin took the hoe and carried out the assault himself. But there is one detail repeated across the accounts. At one point, Alim became frightened after seeing so much blood, stepped outside, and then returned to the room. During the final stage of the attack, the handle of the hoe was used with the kind of force a farmer might use while breaking through hard, rocky ground. It caused devastating internal injuries and ultimately led Eno to die from blood loss. The ordeal continued until nearly 1:30 in the morning, inside a room barely large enough for one person to lie down. To this day, the sources do not fully agree on who carried out the final act directly, but there is no dispute that all three took part in the chain of events that led to the death of the 18-year-old woman. And when it was over, none of them stayed to help her. None of them called for an ambulance. Shortly before 2 a.m., all three men walked out of the room. Before leaving, they washed the blood from their bodies, gathered clothing and covered Eno with it, took several belongings, and locked the door from the outside. Then they crossed the courtyard and scattered in different directions. The dormitory became silent again, as if nothing had ever happened. On the morning of Friday, May 13th, the Polata factory began its shift like any other day. It did not take long for people to notice an empty place on the production line. Eno had not shown up. If she had been an ordinary worker, one absence might have gone unnoticed for a while. But Eno had been given responsibility for coordinating an entire group, so management immediately asked where she was. 3 of her closest friends, Ero, Tikro, and Nopi, began to feel that something was wrong. They sent her messages but received no reply. They called her phone, but no one answered. Eno had never missed work without telling anyone, so as soon as their shift ended, the 3 went straight to the dormitory. When they reached Eno's door, they stopped. The room was locked, but the lock was on the outside. That meant whoever had locked it could not have been the person inside. They called Eno's name again and again. They knocked repeatedly. There was no answer from inside. No one wanted to wait any longer. They ran to find a male worker from the neighboring section and asked him to break the door open. What they saw inside sent everyone there into panic. People began screaming. Police arrived quickly. Eno's body was taken to Tangerang General Hospital, and by May 14th, the autopsy had been completed. The examination documented multiple external injuries to her face and neck. Her right cheekbone and jaw had been fractured by impacts from a hard object, and she had suffered severe internal injuries to both her chest and abdomen. The cause of death was massive blood loss combined with overwhelming internal trauma. That same day, Eno's body was taken back to her hometown and buried in Lebak, Wangi, Serang. She had left home at 18 to earn a living far from her family. Less than a year later, she returned. Now we return to the investigation, and you'll see just how unbelievably short it was. As soon as police processed the crime scene, they noticed something unusual. The victim's cell phone was missing, while her wallet was still there and almost nothing else appeared to have been searched or taken. Along with locking the door from the outside, taking the phone was the second thing those 3 men had done before leaving the room. That led investigators to a very simple conclusion. The phone was probably in the hands of whoever had committed the crime. So police requested that the device be tracked, and the signal was still active. That was the moment the entire case began to collapse. On May 14th, police traced the phone, and the person carrying it was Alim. He was arrested at his home. During his first interrogation, he admitted to carrying out the attack, but insisted that he had acted alone. Police didn't believe him. The condition of the crime scene and the injuries suffered by the victim simply didn't match that version of events. Under further questioning, Alim finally gave them 2 names. Officers immediately went to the men's dormitory and arrested both men. By May 16th, all 3 had officially been identified as suspects, only 3 days after Eno's body was discovered. On May 17th, police conducted a reconstruction of the crime at the dormitory itself, reenacting the events through 31 separate scenes. By then, news of the case had already spread across Indonesia, so when the 3 suspects were brought back to the site, crowds packed the surrounding area. The entire reconstruction unfolded beneath a wall of angry shouting and curses from the people watching. The trials were handled separately because Alim was only 15 years old when the crime was committed. His case therefore went through Indonesia's juvenile justice system and reached court first. On June 16, 2016, at the Tangerang District Court, presiding Judge R.A. Suharni sentenced him to 10 years in prison. The court made it clear that it had found no mitigating circumstances. His actions were described as brutal. He showed no remorse, and his testimony was considered evasive and inconsistent. 10 years was the maximum sentence Indonesian law allowed for a juvenile offender, meaning the court had imposed the harshest punishment legally available. Public outrage across Indonesia was intense. Many people believed 10 years was far too little. But anger could not change the law. The other 2 defendants followed a very different path. The trial of Arifin and Hapriyadi began on October 5, 2016. Throughout the proceedings, both men continued to deny everything, each insisting that he had nothing to do with the young woman's death. Then, on February 8, 2017, presiding Judge Irfan Siragar delivered the verdict. Both men were convicted under Article 340 of Indonesia's Criminal Code for premeditated murder. Arifin was also charged with rape. Both men were sentenced to death. In explaining the decision, the judge said the crime had left a wound in the victim's family that could never truly heal. And even until the very end, neither defendant had admitted what he had done. The court therefore found no reason to show leniency. When the sentences were read, both defendants simply lowered their heads. Neither showed any visible reaction. But in the public gallery, Maputo, Eno's mother, cried out in thanks to God. Throughout the trial, she and other relatives had rented vehicles to travel from Sorang to Tangerang so they could attend every hearing. Before sentencing, she had said that if there were any punishment harsher than death, she would have wanted the court to impose that instead. If the story ended there, it would feel like a relatively complete conclusion. But nearly every account of this case stops in February 2017, and almost no one continues the story beyond that point. A full decade has now passed since that night, and those 2 death sentences still have not been carried out. The reason has to do with something much larger than Eno's case. Indonesia last carried out executions in July 2016, just 2 months after her death, and 7 months before the 2 men convicted of killing her received their death sentences. Since then, Indonesia has not executed anyone, which has led international human rights organizations to classify the country as abolitionist in practice. And the story goes even further. Indonesia has adopted an entirely new criminal code that took effect at the beginning of 2026. Under the new law, the death penalty is treated as a special punishment and comes with a mandatory waiting period of up to 10 years before the sentence can be carried out. During those 10 years, the condemned prisoner remains incarcerated and is evaluated based on behavior and rehabilitation. If the person demonstrates remorse and good conduct, the death sentence may be commuted to life imprisonment. And under the legal principle that the more favorable criminal law may benefit an offender, these provisions can also apply retroactively to people who were sentenced before the new law took effect. Now do the math with me. Arifin and Hapriyadi were sentenced to death in February 2017. As of today, they have spent more than 9.5 years on death row. In other words, 2 men whose trial court once found absolutely no mitigating circumstances are now sitting squarely inside the very window created by the new law, a window that could allow their death sentences to be commuted to life imprisonment. And when it comes to Alam, the calculation is even more chilling. He was arrested in mid-May 2016 and sentenced to a decade behind bars. So even without counting any of the regular sentence reductions available to prisoners in Indonesia, by this point, if nothing unusual has happened, he would already have completed his sentence. I have not found any official source confirming whether he has actually been released, so I will not present that as a fact. I will simply leave the numbers here and let you finish the calculation for yourselves. Today, he is 25 years old. After this case, one phrase was repeated again and again in Indonesia. Teach your sons how to accept rejection. Because all 3 people who entered that room carried the same belief, that a woman's refusal was an insult, something they had the right to retaliate against. But in love, learning to accept rejection is part of what leads us toward genuine happiness. Love taken by force or violence is no longer love. It is possession disguised as love. If even one of those 3 had understood that, perhaps Eno Farihah would still be alive. And today, she would be 28 years old. What do you think about this case and about the sentences handed down to the 3 people responsible? Share your thoughts in the comments below. That's where we'll end today's story. Until next time, I'm Adrian Cole from Crime Documentary Files.